James Harding. And you know, one of the curious things about journalism is when you get to ask someone questions who you think has an unusual number of the answers, and it's like, well, which one do you go for? Well, Dmitri Alperovitch is exactly that kind of person, because he is one of those rare customers. Actually, I'm introducing you now, Dmitri. You're going to get, I don't know whether the lighting is right, because I'm hoping to make you blush. But the reason we're so pleased that Dmitri joins us is that I suppose one of the themes of this morning already has been, where does responsibility lie? How much is it going to lie in the corporate sector to deal with issues of security? How much is it going to lie in the state? How much is it going to sit with us as citizens? And Dmitri, it feels to me as though the things that you've done in your career around cyber, I was reading up some of the research you've done back in 2010, the Aurora case, when few of us even realized that this was a problem. So you've been at this for many, many years. The thing that interests me most, and I wonder whether we could start here, is that the move from Crowdstrike to the new job, to Silverado, feels to me as though it's an attempt to try and understand, if you like, the politics and the global politics of cyber. And we started this morning trying to understand where the real focus of risk might be in terms of cybersecurity, both kind of corporate and national security. And I wonder how, if you'd start with that, just giving us, if you like, the global context for this, how you see things, where the real focus of risk should be.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. Really pleased to be here with all of you. So the important thing to understand about cyber is that cyber is not a technical problem. At its core, it is geopolitics. I coined this phrase over half a decade ago now, that we don't have a cyber problem. We have a Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea problem. And what I mean by that is that when you look at the majority of the most sophisticated, the most impactful attacks we have seen over the last 20 years, they've been either directed by the nation states that I've just mentioned, the military intelligence services of these countries, or they've been orchestrated by criminal groups that are based in these countries and they're being provided essentially a safe haven by the governments of those countries, even if they're not directly involved in their operations. So at its core, we have to think about how do we deal with those four actors. And by the way, it is no accident that it is these four, because they are the primary geopolitical foes, if you will, of Western countries. Cyber is simply warfare by other means, to paraphrase Clausewitz, and that spills over into the cyber domain, the traditional conflict that we face in the physical world. So Silverado is really all about taking sort of the next step in my career. When I started Crowdstrike, it was all about finding technical solutions to the problem, and that's certainly a key part of the solution landscape. But I also appreciated from those early days that policy was absolutely key, that getting the governments to do things like diplomacy, like engaging with those four countries to try to resolve our conflicts or at least lower the temperature, like offensive actions, like trying to preemptively shut down attack infrastructure so that it would be much harder to orchestrate these attacks, like deterrence, retaliation for acts of aggression, so that there'll be much higher costs for future attacks. Those are really, really important things that the government can and should be doing in order to facilitate a safer cyberspace. And then on the domestic front as well, I do believe now that we're at a point where we need regulations on the private sector. Simply waiting for the private sector to do the right thing has not worked. Our security is in abysmal shape, and only, I think, regulation at this point can get us to a higher level of defense.
Well, Dmitri, you've covered a whole range here. And by the way, I am going to try and make sure that we hear from as many people as possible. So, hey, Ash, nice to see you. If there are people who want to weigh in and talk to Dmitri, please just kind of catch my eye. We'll make sure I bring you in. And I've got an iPad here, so if you're online, come and join too. Dmitri, can we do those three things, though, separately? Because I think that there's the big national security threats, there's Crowdstrike, and if you like, the sort of citizen corporate protections, and then there is the relationship between governments and providers, regulators and services. So let's just do one at a time if we can. On those big four threats, You're right, that cyber is not the only way in which they're going to seek to necessarily have their way in the world. But how does cyber change the nature of those opposing relationships?
So cyber gives them an advantage in several ways. One, it's an asymmetric threat. So they're able to reach from across the ocean and touch the United States, for example, in a way that perhaps would be very, very difficult for some of these countries like Iran that may not have capacity to hurt us in any kinetic fashion directly at home because it does not have the reach of missiles or submarines or other traditional military assets. But it also, perhaps even more importantly, provides a way to orchestrate attacks that fall into this gray space between peace and war. So cyber attacks, at least the ones that we have seen to date, have not risen to the level of requiring a kinetic response. They have not resulted in deaths of people by and large. They've not resulted in significant destructions of infrastructure, physical infrastructure. They've been impactful. They've had enormous economic impact, political impact, when you think about interference in elections and the like. But they, the Western countries have struggled about how to respond to something that is in this gray zone where it's bad enough that you can't just ignore it, but it's not bad enough to go to war and actually inflict severe consequences, even frankly, severe economic consequences when you think about sanctions authorities and the like. And that's what gives these states tremendous advantage to express their displeasure, to find ways to evade sanctions that have been placed on them for other actions that they had taken, such as Crimea and Ukraine conflict in the case of Russia, non-proliferation issues in the case of Iran, and so forth, and giving them a way to both fund the regime, particularly in the case of Iran, North Korea, using cyber as an illicit mechanism to continue their economic development, by stealing intellectual property, in the case of North Korea, by hacking directly into banks and stealing tens of millions of dollars. So that's the huge advantage that cyber provides to these countries.
And Dmitri, forgive me for coming at you with, if you like, a counsel of despair, but we had a conversation earlier this morning where, in effect, Tom Hurd here was saying, look, we're going to have to begin to prepare a playbook to use kinetic action, to use military action, to use state power against some of these cyber actors. And the reality is that, as you say, it is in a grey zone. The threshold for military action is going to be quite high. Most likely, governments, given the difficulty they've had in the last 2 decades with military action anyway, are going to find themselves really fearful of engaging militarily against these bad actors. And so isn't it much more likely that the outcome of all of this is that what you keep on seeing is a degree of lawlessness, interference and interventions in your own economies and societies, and actually nothing that actually happens as a result, and a sense globally of powerlessness? Isn't that much more likely the outcome of all of this?
Well, that's a very pessimistic take.
It is.
So I'm not with Tom on the use of kinetic force. I don't think that it is an appropriate response to cyber actions, at least the actions that we have seen to date, but there are things that we can do. So one of the things I've argued in several Washington Post op-eds with my colleague, Matthew Rojansky of the Wilson Center, who's a real expert on Russia, is that when it comes to cyber attacks that the United States and frankly Europe is experiencing right now, the top of mind ones should be ransomware. Those are the ones that are really disrupting our economies, targeting frankly small businesses and schools and police departments, exactly the types of organizations that are least prepared to deal with those effects. So they're having a huge impact economically, huge disruption effect. Obviously, we have seen the Colonial pipeline attack in the US and the impact on supply of energy and long gas lines across the eastern seaboard of the United States. Those things are unacceptable. Now, there's no evidence that the Russian government is involved in any of those attacks, but we know that they're originating from groups that are based in Russia, and the Russian law enforcement has not taken any action against those groups. I've argued in that op-ed that if we put enough pressure on Vladimir Putin in private and let him know that this is an issue of extreme importance to us, that we can no longer tolerate these acts, that we can get action from him on this one issue, precisely because he does not care about these groups. He does not know them. They're just run-of-the-mill criminals. it would be fairly easy for the security services to shut them down, or at a minimum, send a message to them, hey, knock it off, go back to stealing credit cards or other things, but stay away from ransomware. And
Dmitri, forgive me for interrupting. So you get two totally different views of these ransomware groups. One is the one you just described, i.e. sort of little criminal gangs, i.e. knock it off, or actually groups that are businesses themselves quite organized and interwoven into some of the machinery of the Russian state. You think it's the first, not the second?
So I do believe that they're highly organized. I don't believe that they're deeply interwoven into the Russian state. I am quite certain that they are doing payoffs to Russian officials, perhaps even officials in the FSB, but at a low level. First of all, they need protection. They're making tens of millions of dollars. And if you're making tens of millions of dollars in Russia, it's only a matter of time before someone knocks on your doorstep with real guns and asks for a huge cut of that, if not all of that money. And you need someone with more guns to protect you, and that is often the state. So I'm quite confident that they're doing payoffs, but not to Putin, not to his cabinet or anything of the sort. It's perhaps your neighborhood FSB officer or the like. So you still don't have a huge dependence of the Russian government on these groups, and with enough pain, if we threaten severe sanctions against the Russian economy, should he not follow through, to send a message that we're very, very serious, I think you can get a result on this. You can't solve all the problems we have with Russia in the cyber arena, or frankly, in many other areas, but I think this is the one that can be solved.
There'll be lots of people, I'm sure, who've got views about whether that's achievable or not, people with more expertise on both Russia and cyber. So if I might, though, I'd like to just touch on the issues around Crowdstrike. And I suppose you won't be able to see, Dmitri, but there are a number of people asking about just this similar sense of helplessness, not on the state level, but on the individual business level, when they get hit by a cyber attack. And I wonder whether you can just tell us a little bit about the thinking behind the creation of Crowdstrike.
Absolutely. Well, the idea came to us back in 2010, 2011 timeframe, when I started investigating these major attacks like Aurora, and which was a hack of Google by China, and then later on Shady Rat and some other operations. And I realized back then that this was nation states, that this was no longer just criminal groups, as everyone had suspected. They were orchestrating these attacks. You now had the militaries and intelligence services of some very powerful countries like China that were getting into these games, into this game, and going straight after private sector companies who were not prepared to deal with this at all. So that resulted in a complete shift of mindset of how you defend yourself against an adversary that is highly persistent, can be incredibly sophisticated, has thousands, if not tens of thousands of people on their payroll, and has a mission to infiltrate your network, either to steal your trade secrets or to perhaps even shut you down, as we've seen in cases like Sony and Saudi Aramco and many other companies that have been pressured and coerced by nation states like North Korea and Iran. So the environment was starting to get fairly bad, and a new approach that was more focused on intelligence, understanding who's coming after you, what are their capabilities, why they may do it, and how they may do it, so that you can be more proactive at blocking it, was required.
And what do you talked about regulation, and please do weigh in, everyone. I don't want you to feel as though we could do this for a fair old while, so please don't hold back. But Dmitri, you talked about regulation, and within the corporate experience of cyber, I think there is some concern about how you actually monitor the quality of the service that you're getting, the measurements and the transparency of the measurements around cyber attacks and cyber defenses. When you talked about regulation, what would you like to see happen?
So I'll tell you what I don't want to see happen. I don't want to see prescriptive regulations where the government will come in and tell a small business of how they need to defend their network. The government will never be able to keep up with the technology advances or even the threat landscape. So the prescription of what to do, I don't think should be there, but they need to be holding these companies accountable for the result. I've always been a big believer that the way you win on the defensive side in cyber is through speed of action, speed of identifying attackers that are in your network, speed of ejecting them out of your network before they are able to muck with it and make any significant impact. steal data or destroy it. And looking at those metrics, the time to detect, time to respond, I think is really vital. And I think that governments should be requiring companies to track those metrics internally. And then if something does happen, if there is a breach like an Equifax breach or many of the major breaches we have seen over the years, then you can subpoena that information and start looking at where the boards of directors, executives of companies were looking at that data and were responding to it. If the trend lines were not going in the right direction, were they investing more? Were they making changes on their management team to address a problem? And if they weren't, then they're negligent and as a result should face penalties.
So you want to, sorry, let me just understand what you're saying, Dmitri. So you want to create a threshold of responsible behavior for boards and executives around cyber defense. And that would be a way of securing investment in the companies.
I want to start establishing negligence standards where there is a penalty for bad behavior, for underinvestment, for making the wrong choices when it comes to cybersecurity that can be based on outcomes, measuring how effective you are at detection, at response, at recovery, all those critical things that are really important for cyber resilience. And companies that are not doing well at that, however they choose to approach that problem, should face legal liability and penalties.
That's really interesting. So in effect, it's quite similar to environmental standards and environmental impact requirements on boards. It's the same, in effect, the same negligence.
Exactly. Probably more focused on outcome. You know, in the environmental space, it's much more clear what you have to do to make sure you're not polluting the environment. Although, of course, there are severe penalties if there's an accident and you do end up displacing some hazardous chemicals in your surroundings. You're looking in cyber much more at the result and penalizing people after the fact.
And that is there a country that's doing that well now?
There are no countries that are doing that now, and in part because everyone's sort of focused on the front end of how do we tell people what to do, and I think that is counterproductive. Even though there are certain basic steps that a lot of people agree that we should take when it comes to cybersecurity. A common one, for example, that many of you people in the audience have heard about is multi-factor authentication, where you don't just have a password to log in into a particular account, but you may have a text message that arrives on your phone, or even better, an application that gives you a unique code that changes every minute. Those types of things that can help to add to the security of the password. That's a great security measure and can help thwart a lot of the attacks, but I'm hesitant to prescribe it to companies because at the end of the day, people and companies don't have infinite resources, infinite time. So if they're implementing one security measure, they're probably not implementing 10 others. And I don't think it's possible for someone to come in from the outside without any knowledge of the threat environment or that company's network and tell them that you should do X, Y, and Z and not A, B, and C.
Dimitri, thank you. You've got the mic. Will you introduce yourself?
Oh, hello. Jessica Figueres, Vice Chair of the UK Cybersecurity Council. Just curious to know what, if any, role do you think insurance companies and the insurance sectors could play in the solution?
Thank you, Jessica.
Well, I think insurance companies, and thank you for your question, that's a great question, can play a bigger role. I think to date, insurance companies in cyber have been more unhelpful actors than helpful, to be honest with you, because they've been paying for ransoms that companies are paying to these criminal gangs, in fact, encouraging more attacks and sort of fueling this ecosystem. And they've really not been demanding from their customers the types of security measures that you need to raise the level of defenses. So I think it's long past time for insurance companies to step in the game and start actually holding their customers accountable versus just trying to capture as big of a market share of this market as possible.
Can I touch on a different thing? Jessica, thank you. Did you want to come back on that? That's fine. I wanted to ask about, it was interesting, one of the people in the chat, Dmitri, as you were talking, said, I'm interested to know who's had some experience of actually being hacked, being on the end of a cyber attack. And there were a few different people talking about different experiences. And then Joshua Gregory wrote this, and I'm just going to read it to you because I thought it was really striking. He said, I would say the vast majority of the small-scale incidents we see with schools, health, and care organizations are not targeted attacks. They're gangs who are scanning the internet for soft targets. And I'm just interested, we talk a lot in different contexts about inequality. And, to take that kind of climate example, we're looking at big companies who are all figuring out how to monitor their scope 3 emissions, and small companies thinking, what is a scope 3 emission, right? In cyber, presumably you are seeing something similar, which is big companies might have the resources to do something about it, and small companies, and certainly small publicly funded institutions like schools or hospitals, don't have any capacity at all. And so what's your worry about, if you like, cyber inequality, and what's your remedy for it?
Well, I think it's a huge problem. I think there are two problems when it comes to cyber. So you're right. You do have companies that do have the resources to invest. Many of those are investing in the wrong things, quite frankly. And by the way, most of the things that you need to do in cyber to raise your level of security is not about spending money. It's actually about creating the right culture within the organization, making sure that the people in charge of cybersecurity actually have the ear of the executive team and are able to tell them, frankly, what not to do when it comes to their business practices in order to make sure that they're safe. So it's not all about money. Money certainly can help, but money alone does not solve the problem. But you do have a situation with the vast majority of our economy, of course, our small businesses, our nonprofit organization, our municipal governments that do not have the resources, either the money or the personnel and the training to do the right things. And that is a huge issue. And frankly, I think the only way that we address it going forward is by centralizing security. I think a lot of these organizations need to think about moving to cloud providers, large cloud providers that can host their data, that can host their systems, and have the resources to defend them against very sophisticated attacks.
And Dmitri, what happens to those organizations that just don't have those resources at all? What happens if you're running a small school and you're clearly not going to have a CISO?
They're just getting pummeled each and every day by criminal groups that are going after them for ransoms, that are stealing their personal identifiable data, stealing money from their bank accounts. If they're actual small businesses, they are often having to lay off workers or even go out of business. So it is a huge cost in society that we're incurring right now.
And Dmitri, I just want to, I'm going to just read a point. I don't know whether we can actually bring in Paul Clark. I don't know, Sam, whether you're able to do that. But Paul's asking about what the expectation should be on technology companies, on the companies, if you like, that own the skeleton or the architecture of the internet itself. We heard a little this morning about whether or not those people, perhaps even more than cyber providers. There you are, Paul. Do you want to talk about, because I suppose you slightly led the witness there. You said we need to think, to what extent should technology companies be held responsible for this? Do you have a view on what that should be?
Well, I mean, they obviously, as we know, spend several zeros more than any of us can afford to spend, and they do take it, or certainly most of them take it very seriously. But as I said in the chat earlier today, you can spend an infinite amount on tackling cybercrime, and you only know you haven't spent enough when you get breached. But I'm sure they could, they can be incentivized to spend more. But obviously, I think there's obviously more that it's part of the same comment that governments can do to keep their citizens safe. I think a lot of the chat has been about getting the basics wrong. I mean, what proportion of our citizens even know about, let alone use, password managers and things like that. It's not, a lot of it is not rocket science, but we have to do more. We have to do more to incentivize, what good looks like.
And I suppose, Paul, thank you. And I suppose, Dmitri, just if I can piggyback on Paul's comment, I see that, I see that Jayanta Chatterjee is making the point that the cloud is a physical thing. It's a bunch of servers. The question I've got, I suppose, to piggyback on Paul's point is that the point? Is that the eye of the needle at which you say, look, here is a place where we can police behavior and we can hold those cloud servers responsible for actors operating elsewhere in the world?
Well, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the big cloud providers, They have billions of dollars. They're generating huge amounts of cash, and they're using that cash in part to recruit the best talent. So we have a huge talent shortage in this field right now. It's very, very difficult to hire great people. And guess what? The big cloud providers, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons of the world are hiring tons and tons of those people, making it very difficult for anyone else to compete. So if they're going to have this aggregation of resources, money, talent, and capability, I think it's only fair that we start holding them accountable for the end result.
Dmitri, I see that we're very close to running out of time, and although there's these great points from Dev Gill and Joyanta Achji and others, I'm going to, if I might, just finish with one question, which is, I started off by talking about Aurora 2010, I think that was. We're now 2021. You've got more and more people in this room, online, more and more people who are alive to cyber, and yet it feels as though the problem is getting significantly worse, significantly bigger. And so even though there is a huge amount of time and money and resource being plowed into cyber defenses, I can't help wondering whether we're going to reach a tipping point where the extent to which cyber disrupts economic activity is similar to the way in which, in my own world, in the media, the internet has disrupted behavior in information. And I wonder whether you could just finish by giving us a sense of quite how much we're going to have to live with marketplaces that are fundamentally changed by cyber attacks, ransomware, security costs, the insurance point that Jessica made. What does the 2020s look like?
I don't think it looks great unless we radically change our approach to this problem. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view, there have only been a couple of instances where cyber attacks have really impacted huge swaths of the nation. You know, one of them was in the UK, of course, during the WannaCry episode when your NHS was shut down, or many of the hospitals were shut down because of that virus launched by North Korea. Another one was this year, the colonial hacks in the United States, where average Americans, millions of them, experienced inconveniences in their daily lives by having to sit in a gas station waiting for gas for hours on end. So those are, one of the few times when millions of people said, "Oh my God, cyber is actually impacting my daily life." It's not just about receiving a notification in the mail that some provider had been hacked and my personal identifiable information is stolen. And the risk to me is kind of ephemeral. I don't really appreciate what is being done or what is the impact. But the more we start to see those real world effects, the more I think the population is going to demand answers in the form of regulation on private companies, answers in terms of confronting the regimes that are not doing enough to curb the cybercrime activity, as we've talked about, or actually engaging in direct offensive actions with their government resources against us. And that's ultimately the solution to try to curb this really pandemic, if you will, in cyberspace.
Well, Dmitri, thank you. As you can tell, I feel like we've cantered through a bunch of really quite big subjects. And yet I still come away with a few things. I do come away with a clarity around bad state actors rather than a global cyber problem. I come away with a clarity too about, a new clarity actually, about what's a regulatory intervention that feels extremely doable around negligence and corporate responsibility. I have to confess I come away with a quite profound set of worries around citizen sense of powerlessness and a cyber inequality that I'm not sure exactly how we're going to resolve, but we're going to have a crack at resolving it in the next session, because we're going to go, Dmitri, from this conversation to a conversation about what are the best cyber defenses. My colleague Alexei Mostras is going to lead that conversation, but we can't, usually if you come to any journalistic endeavor, you at least get a glass of wine, possibly a round of applause. We don't give you either of those things, but we can wave you merrily on your way and say thank you very much for sparing us the time to be with you. Thank you with us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.